All right, second time is a charm. I apologize if you were trying to watch my first video and it was messed up. Apparently my mic wasn't plugged all the way in. It got a little bit loose. Anyway, back to what I was saying about this. First and foremost, big shout out to Tom Hussein, Sharp Talk podcast. He has a web store. I'll link it down below. I'll link his page down below. I tried to link the Sharp Talk podcast Instagram down below, but I couldn't get it to pull up. I'll try to edit that in later. But that's where I got this shirt from. And if you've been keeping up with things, I'm sure you know how this shirt came about. If you want to get into that, or if you don't know and you want to get into that, ask somebody else. I'm not here to get into all of that, but I do think the shirt is hilarious. And if you didn't follow me, I'm the self-appointed lieutenant of the HRC police. With all that said, that kind of segues me into this video. Recently, I've decided to stop using my Walmart Santoku knife and get into some higher end kitchen knives, so that way I can really start enjoying cooking more. Because for me, I always regretted not having a better knife. It made everything in the kitchen a little bit more difficult to do. So I'm ready to make the leap. I started talking to Steve, Super Steel Steve, I'm sure everybody already knows him. And what he said to me is, he said, send me 5 knives and then, I'll kind of sort through them for you and tell you about the different ones. Well, I sent him 5 knives. They were 5 different knives, very different knives. And now I understand what he was saying about that after doing some more research. But he was good enough to give me some strong suggestions. He was good enough to point out to me that I probably want to go with a Gyoto style knife. And guys, I'm not some kind of chef knife master here. I'm just a guy that likes to cook at home. I'm just getting into this. So if I mispronounce something, feel free to correct me. But I mean, I'm not claiming to be an expert. Now, for whatever reason, somehow that seems to get misconstrued, and I get some weird comments. I'm not saying I'm an expert. I'm just sharing with you what I have found and how it's interesting to me how that applies to our side of the knife world, which is the folding knife world. So anyway, he suggested the Gyoto knife. I at first settled on the Santoku, but I eventually decided to get this Gyoto knife right here. And I really didn't think much about it. I've been on Chef Knives to Go before. It's a well-known website. The Santoku knife I had chosen was a Konosuke. He told me, it's a laser. It's going to cut very well, X, Y, and Z. So I said, you know what? I really want something a little bit longer, so that way I'm not undergunned in the kitchen. And since I'm not going to have a full set of knives at this point, I want something that I can use and kind of make it work until I can add some other knives. You can see, not a cheap knife. So it's going to take me some time to add in the other, 1 or 2 knives that I need to really round out a decent set of kitchen knives, high-end kitchen knives. So anyway, I started looking at the description below, and one of the first things that kind of jumps out to me is they're talking about the steel. So, okay, cool. I'm always up for learning about steel. The next thing that kind of jumps out to me is they start talking about the hardness of the steel. Okay, that's interesting. Then they go on, they talk about it's a fall through food contender. So they're talking about the blade grind, and they're talking about just how thin of a knife this is and how well it should cut in the kitchen. So all very interesting things. So I really didn't think much of it. I added it to my favorites list and I kind of moved on. Well, being myself, I started doing more and more research, and I started looking at other websites. And here's an example. I started and these are just random knives I pulled up on random websites. So, I started looking and I started noticing similar things. We're talking about steel type. We're talking about blade hardness. We're talking about geometry. We're talking about blade shapes. I mean, just on and on and on, just, time after time after time. Same thing, different website. Same type of information. Very first line, they're talking about the hardness of the blade. They're talking about the steel type. They're talking about all of these things that for some reason has become a controversy in the EDC world. However, over on the kitchen knife side of things, it just constantly keeps coming up, and it's just, here, let's see, it just constantly keeps coming up. and they're talking about the steel type. They're talking about blade grind. I mean, they're talking about the bevel itself, the edge, the hardness. It's the same thing over and over and over again, time after time. So once I kind of started looking at some knives, you know, I saw some things that I liked, but I needed to know more. So that led me to kind of jump over to YouTube. And once I jumped over to YouTube, I ran into Chef Knives to Go video, which I linked over on my Instagram page, and actually played the audio. And they're talking about chef knives in general, and they're talking about how to pick a chef knife, the different types of chef knives, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what would you know? The very first thing they talk about is the blade shape. They talk about the blade grind. They talk about the steel type, and they talk about the hardness of that steel. Same exact things over and over and over again, just generally accepted facts that exist in the kitchen world that we, for whatever reason, are having trouble wrapping our mind around in the folder world. And, you know, the interesting thing is when you're using a knife in the kitchen, or specifically the knives that I'm talking about, that I'm looking at personally, they are some pretty high-end knives. So we're talking about knives that typically are used in a professional setting 6, 7, 8 hours a day. Bones, tendon, muscle, you name it. So no, are we necessarily cutting things that we typically think about on our day-to-day use case? Not necessarily, but there is still lateral force being exerted, aka prying. There is still some hard things being cut, i.e. bones, cartilage, like I said, tendons, which is, you know, semi-soft tissue, but you get the point. So the same types of uses are being carried out in the kitchen. So it's not a case of oh, but you don't do those things in a kitchen. You absolutely do. And one of the things that they talked about in the first video was the difference between Western style knives and Japanese style knives. And they talked about Western style knives being a little bit thicker, a little bit heavier stock, slightly different blade grinds, softer steels, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that is because in a Western style of cooking, we are breaking chickens apart, you know, splitting chickens up. We are cracking through bones. We are cutting up lobsters. We are doing things that are quote unquote abusive to knives. And in order to do that, Western style knives are softer and they have a different blade geometry and shape. They're built for that type of use. Whereas Japanese knives are built upon a use case of finesse, precision cutting, very, very detailed work when you're working on whatever it is you're cutting in the kitchen. So with that being said, you know, that kind of applies to all of this. Well, the hardness doesn't matter. The blade steel doesn't matter. X, Y, and Z. And if you look at the kitchen world, they're saying it absolutely does. Carbon steel versus stainless steel, or some hybrid, some semi stainless steel, and then the hardness and the blade shape and the blade grind. So if I want to make some very precise cuts, I want a very thin blade that is probably going to be fairly hard because I want it to hold a great edge and I want it to hold it for a fairly long time because I'm in the kitchen and I'm going to be using this for hours. For hours on end. So when I do that kind of a thing, I know that when I use that knife, I have to use it in a particular use case. If I want to debone a chicken, or I need to, for some reason, you know, cleave up a chicken or whatever like that, I'm going to switch the knife type that I'm using, which is going to be a different blade steel, more than likely, and definitely a different blade shape and blade geometry. So we have to pick the tool that fits the job. For some reason in the EDC folder community, we seem to want to take one knife and apply it across the board. And then when the knife fails, we want to say, oh, see, this is why you don't want a hard knife. Oh, see, this is why you don't want a thin knife. Oh, see, this is why that doesn't work. in the chef world, in the cooking world, you don't blame the tool, you blame the user. If I decide to take a laser Japanese Gyuto knife and I want to, split a chicken and I blow the edge out, somebody next to me in the kitchen is going to look and say, that wasn't the right knife for that job. You should have used a meat cleaver. You should have used a Western style knife. You should have used, whatever. There is a knife for each use and a use for each knife. And for whatever reason, we're not translating that over into the EDC world. So then we want to argue about, well, you don't want a knife that's too hard because it'll chip. Well, you don't want a knife that's too thick behind the edge because it won't cut. There are use cases for all of these knives. You need to find the right knife for your use. So that was very interesting to me. But I didn't talk about this video here. This is another video that I stumbled across, and you can see here it says how to choose the perfect knife, 4 things to consider. And if you scroll down, it shows the timestamps, and you can see blade shape, belly, handle, stamped versus forged steel types, face grind, steel types, continued, Grantons and scallops, talking about the scoops that are taking out the sides of blades that are supposed to allow food to not stick to the blade, steel types, continued again, carbon steel, cladding, powder steel, on and on and on and on and on. So again, we're right back into the same conversation because all of these things do matter, and they will provide you with a better experience if you are using the appropriate knife with the appropriate hardness, the appropriate steel, and the appropriate geometry in the appropriate application. So it just was very interesting to me that for whatever reason in the in the EDC community, that's a controversy. In the chef world, that's just a common understood fact. I'm going to use a Gyuto to chop up my vegetables, or I'm going to use I believe the true vegetable knife, just pure vegetable knife, is like a Naguri or whatever. Like I said, I'm not an expert. It's a knife that starts with an N, but it doesn't have a point on it, and it looks like a smaller version of a meat cleaver, but it's for chopping vegetables. So it absolutely is just an accepted fact in the kitchen world, but in the EDC world, we don't take those things into account, and we just apply logic across the entire spread of knives, and we're canceling knives out that are not necessarily bad knives or bad concepts because we want one knife to serve every single purpose that we possibly could use it for. And I think that in and of itself is why so many people that are into the hobby own so many different knives, because I think some people do realize one knife is not going to serve every single role. So that's that portion of it, just dealing with the knives itself. Flipping forward to talking about the accessories and everything, even when you're talking about sharpening stones, if you do some research on that, and I do encourage you all, please look into these things and double check me. Come back, talk with me, give me your thoughts, share. I would love to hear what you all have to say. But even when you start talking about sharpening stones as an accessory, there are soaking stones and there are splash and go stones. And the soaking stone is a stone that has to be submerged in water for some period of time before it's ready to use to sharpen. And a splash and go is pretty much self-explanatory. You splash some water on it and you're ready to go ahead and sharpen. So when you're talking about stones that you're going to use to sharpen these higher end knives, which 9 times out of 10 people use synthetics, there are natural stones. Some people do use diamonds, at least to reprofile or set an initial edge. But that's a whole different conversation. But when we're talking about synthetic stones and or natural stones to an extent, there's also a discussion on how hard the stone is versus how hard the blade steel is. There are certain stones that are on the softer side of the scale, and you can only sharpen knives up to a certain hardness, because if you sharpen a knife that's harder, then, usually the numbers that get thrown around are 60, 61. Ironically, you've heard that number talked about before, but 60, 61, then you can gouge the stones pretty easily, and it's not a good idea. You need a different stone to use for that knife and that hardness. There are also stones that you want to use with different types of abrasives for different levels of steel. So not every stone is going to work perfectly for every knife. And there is some crossover, and there are some stones that you can use on harder, more wear resistant steels that obviously will work on softer, less wear resistant steels. But just generally speaking, there are different stones for different use cases. And that's all based around hardness and steel type. So again, these are just generally accepted facts in the kitchen knife world that for whatever reason in the EDC world, there seems to be some debate over. So I just found that very, very interesting. And I wanted to bring that to you guys, show you some of the things that I've been finding out as I dive a little bit deeper into this kitchen knife hobby of mine now. I look forward to receiving my knife. Definitely want to get in the kitchen, make some soups and stews this winter with my new knives. And I'm just really excited. But I found this information very interesting, and the differences, even though they are two cultures that both use knives, the differences between the EDC community and the knife community, it's very interesting to me. So please share your thoughts with me. I'd love to hear. Comment down below. Again, I apologize for the first video being messed up, and remember, a lazy man carries a dull knife.